The atmosphere inside the American Politics Unfiltered studio was electric, charged with an anticipation so thick it felt almost tangible. The air buzzed with the low hum of whispered conversations and shifting bodies as an audience of politically divided spectators filled the room, each person keenly aware that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The massive LED screen at the back of the stage glowed with sharp, contrasting colors, deep blue and bold red, a visual representation of the ideological battlefield that was about to unfold. In the dimly lit audience section, clusters of viewers leaned forward, some with arms crossed tightly, others gripping the edges of their seats, their expressions betraying a mix of excitement and simmering tension. This was more than just another televised debate. It was a collision of two Americas, a war of words that had already begun long before either guest had even spoken. At the center of the stage, bathed in the glow of studio lights, sat James Carter, the esteemed host of the show. A seasoned journalist with years of experience moderating high-stakes debates, Carter exuded a controlled intensity, his measured demeanor acting as the only force of balance in a discussion that promised to be anything but restrained. Dressed in a dark navy suit, he adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with practiced ease, his fingers lightly grazing the stack of notes placed neatly before him. His deep voice, a perfect blend of authority and intrigue, cut through the tension as he turned toward the camera, his sharp gaze locking onto the millions watching from home. Tonight, America, we are witnessing a defining moment, a debate that isn't just about politics, it's about the very soul of this country. Two powerful voices, each representing a starkly different vision for the future, will go head-to-head in a clash that has already ignited firestorms across social media. On one side, a progressive icon who has built a career on challenging the establishment, a congresswoman who has fearlessly taken on corporate elites, the billionaire class, and most recently, former President Donald Trump. On the other, a rising, conservative powerhouse, a fierce defender of the America First movement, and a woman who has made it her mission to dismantle what she calls the radical left's grip on power. As the camera shifted, the focus landed on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, seated on the left side of the stage. She was composed, yet undeniably aware of the weight of the moment, dressed in a sleek navy blazer, her dark brown hair neatly tucked behind her ears. She exuded a calm but intense energy, the kind that made it clear she had come prepared for battle. AOC's lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile as she adjusted the lapel of her jacket, her fingers momentarily tapping against the desk in front of her, a barely noticeable motion, but one that signaled she was ready. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, locked onto Carter, but every so often, they flickered toward the woman seated opposite her. And there she was, Karoline Leavitt, positioned at the right end of the stage, her posture rigid, controlled, exuding the kind of self-assured confidence that could either inspire or infuriate, depending on which side of the political spectrum one stood. Dressed in a striking deep red dress, the boldness of her outfit seemed to reflect the fire she had brought with her to this debate. Her platinum blonde hair, perfectly styled, framed her sharp features, but it was her eyes that held the most. Weight, focused, calculating, unwavering. Unlike AOC, there was no trace of amusement or subtle theatrics. Leavitt was here with a mission, and she made no effort to disguise it. Her fingers intertwined lightly over the desk, a studied picture of restraint. But beneath the polished exterior, there was an unmistakable tension in her shoulders, as if she were a tightly wound coil ready to spring at the right moment. Carter's voice lowered slightly, adding weight to his next words, his gaze shifting between the two women. These two women could not be more different in their political philosophies, but one thing is certain. They both believe unequivocally that they are fighting for the future of America. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, in recent weeks, you have been vocal about your belief that former President Donald Trump represents a clear and present danger to American democracy. You've warned that his return to power could mean the unraveling of the very institutions that uphold our nation's stability. Press Secretary Leavitt, you've repeatedly dismissed these concerns as nothing more than hysteria from the radical left, arguing that Trump is the only one capable of restoring true American values. The weight of the moment hung between them, the silence stretching just long enough to build anticipation before Carter turned to his first guest. His voice, though steady, carried the unmistakable edge of provocation, designed to elicit a response that would ignite the confrontation. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, let's begin with you. Why do you believe Donald Trump and his movement pose an imminent threat to democracy? What makes you so certain that the America First movement isn't just another iteration of conservative politics, but something far more dangerous? The camera zoomed in, focusing on AOC's face as she inhaled deeply, her lips parting as if carefully considering her opening salvo. A sharp glint flashed in her eyes, not of anger, but of certainty, of conviction. She wasn't just ready to respond, she was ready to strike. And then she spoke. And just like that, the war of words had begun. The tension in the studio shifted the moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez parted her lips to speak. The hum of anticipation in the audience faded into silence, as if the air itself had thickened, forcing the room into a collective breath hold. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but charged, every syllable carefully measured to cut through the noise before it even started. "This isn't about conservatism versus progressivism," she began, leaning slightly forward, her dark eyes flickering between James Carter and the woman seated opposite her. "This is about something far more dangerous. The movement behind Donald Trump isn't just a political ideology. It's a deliberate, coordinated attempt to dismantle our democracy. We are talking about a man who openly encouraged an attack on the Capitol, who refused to accept the results of a free and fair election, and who continues to spread conspiracy theories that erode public trust in our institutions. That is not normal. That is not democracy. That is the foundation of authoritarianism." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The camera panned to Karoline Leavitt, capturing the briefest flicker of a smirk before she straightened her posture, a subtle yet deliberate move that conveyed both defiance and control. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to signal her confidence before finally responding. "You know what's fascinating, Congresswoman?" Leavitt's voice was smooth, almost amused. "You talk about democracy, yet your party has done nothing but try to silence opposing voices. When conservatives question election security, we're dangerous. When we demand answers about government overreach, we're conspiracy theorists. But when your side pushes baseless accusations, when you incite division, when you encourage riots under the banner of social justice, suddenly that's activism, that's democracy." A murmur rippled through the audience, and for the first time Carter leaned forward slightly, sensing the first real crackle of confrontation. "Are you equating January 6th with Black Lives Matter protests?" AOC shot back, her voice tightening. "Because one was an attempted coup led by a sitting president, and the other was a movement demanding justice after years of systemic oppression." Leavitt exhaled, shaking her head slightly, as if she had been expecting this exact line of attack. She didn't take the bait, at least not directly. Instead, she tilted her head, a look of feigned curiosity flashing across her features. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice laced with a sharp-edged politeness. "If people burn down businesses, attack law enforcement, and create absolute chaos, it's justified as long as it's for a cause you approve of. But if Americans, who had serious, legitimate concerns about election integrity, dare to question the system, they're extremists. That's your standard?" The audience reacted instantly, some cheering, others booing. The dividing line between the two sides was no longer theoretical. It was palpable, living, breathing tension in the room. Carter raised a hand, attempting to maintain some semblance of order. "Let's be clear about something," AOC pressed on, eyes narrowing slightly. "The election was not stolen. There was no mass fraud, no coordinated effort to manipulate results. Those are outright lies, and every time people like you repeat them, you are feeding into a dangerous fantasy that led to a violent insurrection." Leavitt's expression didn't falter, but her hands, which had been calmly folded before her, slowly unlinked. "And yet," she countered, her voice dropping just slightly, a rhetorical knife sliding into place, "when Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, the left spent 4 years calling Trump an illegitimate president. There were protests, lawsuits, attempts to overturn results, mainstream media amplifying theories about Russian collusion. But when it's your side contesting an election, that's just defending democracy, right? The audience erupted again, Carter's attempts at neutrality growing visibly strained. "We are not going to engage in whataboutism," AOC started, but Leavitt cut her off, her voice rising just slightly. "No, what we're not going to do is pretend the Democratic Party hasn't played this exact game before. You don't get to rewrite history, Alexandria. The only difference between then and now is that this time your side is in power, and suddenly questioning an election is unacceptable." Funny how that works. A sharp tension settled over the set. Even Carter, typically composed under pressure, could feel the conversation slipping out of his control. Both women were no longer just debating. They were dissecting each other's arguments with surgical precision, each attempting to land a decisive blow. He exhaled slowly, then straightened his papers as a clear signal that it was time to pivot. But the audience knew this was just the beginning. The real explosion was still coming. The energy in the American Politics Unfiltered studio had shifted from tense to outright volatile. The atmosphere was no longer just thick with anticipation, it was crackling with the raw heat of confrontation. The ideological battle that had, until now, simmered beneath the surface, had finally reached its boiling point. This was no longer a debate, this was a war. Karoline Leavitt and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were no longer just two political figures exchanging opinions. They were combatants, their words sharpened into weapons, their body language coiled and ready to strike. The camera feed flicked between them, capturing AOC's piercing glare, her nostrils flaring slightly, her hands now clenched into small, controlled fists on the desk, and Leavitt's unflinching stare, her jaw set, her fingers tapping against the polished surface as if itching for the next retort. James Carter, for all his experience as a moderator, was losing control. He knew it. The audience knew it. And most dangerously, the two women on stage knew it too. "All right, let's," Carter began, attempting to steer the discussion back into safer waters. But he was too late. AOC leaned forward, her voice slicing. Through the air like a blade. "Let's talk about rewriting history, Karoline, because you and your party have been on a non-stop mission to erase what happened on January 6th, to downplay it, to twist it into something it wasn't. You call it protests, but what happened that day was terrorism, and it was incited by the man you defend every single day." The words hit like a thunderclap. The mention of terrorism sent a visible ripple through the audience, drawing audible gasps, shouts of agreement, and grumbles of discontent. Leavitt didn't flinch. If anything, she smiled. A small, knowing smile, the kind that sends a chill down the spine of an opponent who knows they've just walked into a trap. "You love that word, don't you?" Leavitt's voice was lower now, deliberate. "Terrorism. That's what you call a group of Americans. Yes, Americans, who were angry, who believed something wasn't right, who felt unheard. But when your side storms government buildings, blocks highways, sets police precincts on fire, that's what? Justice? Revolution? Spare me the double standard, Alexandria." The audience exploded. Cheers, boos, people turning to one another in heated discussion. The studio was no longer an audience of spectators. It was a battleground. AOC's expression darkened. "Are you actually justifying what happened that day? Are you actually defending those people?" Leavitt tilted her head, eyes gleaming with an almost predatory sharpness. "I'm saying that not everything is as black and white as you want it to be. The left has spent years pushing people to the edge, silencing them, calling them deplorables, mocking their struggles. And when they finally pushed back, yes, too far, I'll admit, your only response was to label them domestic terrorists, instead of asking why they were so desperate to be heard." AOC let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, so now it's our fault. Your people stage an attempted coup and somehow we're to blame. Jesus Christ, Karoline, you're out of your mind." Leavitt's smile vanished in an instant, replaced with a hard, cutting edge. "What's truly insane," she fired back, "is that people like you, elitist, disconnected, completely out of touch with what's happening outside your Twitter bubble, think you can lecture half this. Country on what democracy is. You claim to represent the people, but you've built your entire career on dismissing them, ridiculing them, vilifying them. You stand up here and talk about justice, but where was your voice when people's businesses were being burned to the ground? Where was your outrage when conservative students were being harassed on campuses, or when people were fired for daring to say that maybe, just maybe, America isn't a racist hellscape? The words landed like a blow. The crowd roared, some erupting into applause, others shouting over them in pure, unfiltered outrage. AOC's face flushed, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no more veneer of amusement, no more playing it cool. She could feel the weight of the room, shifting. Not entirely against her, but enough to make her tighten her grip on the argument. "You want to talk about silencing voices?" she shot back, voice rising. "Your party has spent decades suppressing votes, gutting civil rights, attacking marginalized communities, banning books, censoring teachers. Oh, give me a break." Leavitt interjected, rolling her eyes, waving her hand in exaggerated disbelief. "Spare me the oppression Olympics, Alexandria. Your side controls every major institution, Hollywood, the media, academia. You don't just have a voice, you have a megaphone. And anyone who disagrees with you is labeled a bigot, a Nazi, a fascist. That's not democracy, that's thought control." The volume in the studio hit a peak, voices overlapping, a crescendo of chaos. James Carter stood abruptly, raising his hands. All right, enough." But the two women weren't listening anymore. They were locked in, face to face. And neither was backing down. The climax had arrived, and now the only thing left was the explosion. The studio was in chaos. The shouting, the clashing voices, the sheer force of ideological warfare had turned American politics unfiltered into something more than just a talk show. It had become a battlefield, live and unfiltered, broadcast to millions. The tension was no longer simmering. It was a raging wildfire, and at the center of it stood Karoline Leavitt and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, two women locked in ideological combat, their words striking like fists, their arguments landing like artillery shells. James Carter knew he had to step in. This was his show, his platform, but for the last several minutes it had completely slipped from his control. He could feel the vibrations of the moment, the way history seemed to be etching itself into the fabric of American discourse right in front of his eyes. This was the kind of television moment that would be clipped, dissected, turned into political ammunition for both sides. And it wasn't over yet. All right. Let's bring this back," Carter said, his voice firm, palms raised as if trying to physically hold back the storm that had erupted on his stage. Leavitt, still stone-faced, her composure a weapon in and of itself, simply adjusted her microphone, exhaling sharply through her nose as if trying to force herself back into calculated control. AOC, meanwhile, was still leaning forward, her hands now flat on the desk, her body physically pushing toward her opponent, as if sheer force of will could break through the ideological wall between them. "We are not here to just scream at each other," Carter pressed, though he knew that ship had long sailed. He turned to AOC first, offering her the illusion of a final word, knowing full well that Leavitt would demand the last rebuttal. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, before we close, what do you say to the millions of Americans who believe Trump and the America First movement are not a threat, but a correction? That he is not the problem, but the solution?" AOC didn't hesitate. Her response was ready, burning at the tip of her tongue, begging to be unleashed. "I say they're being lied to," she shot back, her voice clear, unwavering, even as frustration still clung to the edges of her breath. "I say that for all of their talk about freedom and fighting the system, they are being used by a man who doesn't care about them, who has never cared about them, who has spent his entire life exploiting workers, manipulating the truth, and bending the law to suit his own interests. And yet, because he feeds into their anger, into their worst fears, they believe he's fighting for them. But he's not. He never has. And he never will." The room was still. Even Leavitt, who had been bracing for her own response, let the weight of those words hang for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, but then the moment passed, and the fire returned. "And I say," Leavitt countered, her voice sharper, stronger, cutting through the silence like a blade, "that you and your party have spent so much time looking down on these people that you don't even recognize them as Americans anymore. You don't get why they're angry because you've never listened. You don't understand why they fight because you don't have to. You sit in Washington, you play hero, you paint yourself as the champion of the people, but the second someone you don't control actually fights back against your system, suddenly it's dangerous. Give me a break. Donald Trump is not the problem, you are. Your party is. The people who tell Americans they're too stupid to think for themselves. The people who silence dissent because they can't handle being challenged. The people who would rather destroy this country than admit that for once they might be wrong." The audience erupted. Applause, shouting, outrage. It was chaos incarnate. James Carter was already gesturing frantically to the producers off camera, signaling that they needed to cut to commercial before this got even further out of hand. But the damage was done. This moment was going viral. As the show's theme music began playing over the storm of voices, Carter forced a tight-lipped smile, masking the absolute insanity of what had just unfolded. "And that," he said, over the noise, "is where we'll have to leave it tonight. Thank you to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, and to all of you at home. Clearly, this is a conversation that is far from over." The screen faded to black. But how in the world it was only just beginning? Within minutes, clips of the debate had flooded Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, each side weaponizing sound bites, claiming victory, painting the other as a liar, a fraud, a villain. Hashtags began trending. Leavitt destroys AOC Chas, AOC exposes MAGA, American politics unfiltered. Debate of the year cable news channels scrambled to dissect what had just happened. Conservative outlets hailed Leavitt's performance as a masterclass in composure and hard-hitting truths. Progressive networks blasted her as a dangerous propagandist, dismissing real threats to democracy. Pundits picked apart every moment, every gesture, every rhetorical jab, turning the debate into a cultural moment, a political lightning rod, a symbol of just how deeply divided America had become. And somewhere in the chaos of it all, both AOC and Karoline Leavitt sat behind closed doors, watching the aftermath unfold, knowing that this was not just a debate. This was a battle for the future, and it was far from over.